When best-selling novelist Charlotte returns to her estranged hometown for the first time in 20 years, she meets Ethan, a lonely boy who believes the town's Christmas tree can grant wishes. Drawn to his quiet resilience, Charlotte embarks on a journey to uncover his past, only to find herself confronting her own shattered family bonds. As truths unravel and emotions run high, Charlotte faces a life-changing choice. Can she give Ethan the family he longs for? And will helping him heal be the key to mending her own broken heart? The snow fell quietly over the small town of Woodhaven, blanketing the empty streets in a powdery white. The air carried the scent of pine and distant fireplaces, but the warmth never quite reached the main square, where a towering Christmas tree stood in the center. Charlotte's leather boots crunched against the icy ground as she stopped at the edge of the square, staring up at the tree. The memory of her mother's laughter echoed faintly in her mind, the way she used to guide Charlotte and her siblings in hanging ornaments, her voice like a melody that had been silenced far too soon. 20 years had passed since Charlotte had last seen the square in person, though her memories had never dulled. Now, she stood on its edge, wrapped in a thick coat that couldn't protect her from the chill of regret. She shifted the weight of the invitation in her pocket, the reason she'd come back to the town that once held her heart. The festival committee had begged her to be the guest speaker at their annual Christmas festival, celebrating her success as a best-selling novelist. But standing here, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the ghosts of the past or her siblings, who would no doubt have their own opinions about her return. A soft laugh broke her thoughts. Charlotte turned to see a young boy standing a few feet away. His dark curls poked out from under a knit hat, and his coat hung too loosely on his slender frame. He was holding a small paper star, its edges crinkled but carefully crafted. He jumped, reaching toward one of the lower branches of the tree, but the star dangled precariously in his grip, just out of his reach. "Do you need help?" Charlotte asked, her voice breaking the stillness. The boy froze, startled, before slowly turning to her. His brown eyes were wide, reflecting the glow of the string lights wrapped around the tree. "Are you a stranger?" he asked cautiously. Charlotte smiled faintly. "Sort of, but I used to live here. I'm just visiting." The boy seemed to consider this before nodding. "Okay then. Can you help me? I can't reach the good branches." She stepped closer, crouching slightly to his level. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he said, holding up the star. "I'm the tree's guardian." "Is that so?" Charlotte replied, a flicker of amusement lighting her features. "And what does a guardian do?" "I make sure the tree looks right. It grants wishes, you know, but only if it's decorated the right way." He spoke with a certainty that made her chest ache. She took the star and carefully placed it on one of the higher branches, stepping back to admire their work. "There," she said softly. "It looks perfect now." Ethan grinned, his teeth small and slightly crooked. "Thank you. The tree has to be ready before Christmas Eve. That's when the wishes come true." Charlotte tilted her head. "What's your wish, Ethan?" He hesitated, his smile faltering. "I don't know yet," he mumbled, looking away. "But I'll figure it out." Before she could respond, a voice called out from across the square. "Ethan!" A woman in a heavy coat waved, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You're not supposed to be out here." "That's Miss Ingrid," Ethan whispered. "She runs the home." "The home?" Charlotte echoed. Ethan gave her a sheepish look. "The group home. I live there, but I sneak out sometimes and for the tree." The woman reached them, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm sorry if he was bothering you," she said, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He has a knack for slipping away." "He wasn't any trouble," Charlotte said quickly. "We were just talking about the tree." Miss Ingrid softened slightly, though her worry lines remained. "It's his favorite. He comes here every year, says it's his special job." She sighed, shaking her head. "Come on, Ethan. Let's get you back inside. It's too cold out here." Ethan glanced at Charlotte one last time. "Thanks for helping me." As they walked away, Charlotte felt an unfamiliar pang in her chest. She watched them disappear into the night, the boy's small figure swallowed by the darkness. The square was silent again, but something had shifted. Charlotte turned back to the tree, her eyes lingering on the paper star. For the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone. The following morning, the town square buzzed with the kind of energy Charlotte hadn't felt in years. Vendors set up stalls selling hot cider and handmade ornaments. Children chased each other in oversized coats, and strings of lights twinkled against the pale winter sun. Charlotte kept her distance, seated at an old cafe on the square's edge, watching the familiar chaos unfold. She nursed a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, her mind turning back to Ethan and his crinkled paper star. There was something about him, a quiet loneliness she recognized all too well. She had felt it too, after her parents passed away, when the weight of keeping her family together had fallen to her. And then, in one swift argument over inheritance, over blame, over grief, her siblings had splintered apart like the brittle glass ornaments they once hung on the tree. The sight of Miss Ingrid's stern but gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder the night before had stayed with her. A group home. Charlotte had always imagined such places as cold and impersonal, filled with rules and routines but devoid of warmth. She couldn't shake the idea of the boys sneaking out to decorate the tree, searching for something that seemed too big for his small frame. Charlotte drained the rest of her coffee and made her decision. She buttoned her coat, ignoring the slight tremor in her hands, and began walking toward the group home. The address wasn't hard to find. Woodhaven was still small enough that everyone knew where everything was. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, its porch sagging under years of weather and use. But the window boxes overflowed with winter greenery, and the steps were freshly shoveled. She knocked twice before the door creaked open. Miss Ingrid stood in the entryway, surprise flickering across her face. "Miss Holloway," she said, glancing over Charlotte's shoulder as if expecting someone else. "This is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding," Charlotte began. I met Ethan last night. He mentioned he lives here and I wanted to—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain why she was there. Miss Ingrid hesitated before stepping aside. "Come in. It's freezing out there." The interior of the home was nothing like Charlotte expected. The smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air, and a fire crackled in the living room hearth. Children's drawings covered the walls, their stick figures bright with lopsided smiles and colorful houses. The space was worn but alive, full of the small touches that made it feel like someone cared. "Ethan's in the playroom," Miss Ingrid said, leading Charlotte down a narrow hallway. "Though I have to ask, why are you here?" Charlotte paused. "I don't know," she admitted. "He just reminded me of someone. Me, maybe." Miss Ingrid gave her a long, assessing look before pushing open a door. Inside, Ethan was seated cross-legged on the floor, carefully tying ribbons to small ornaments. When he looked up and saw Charlotte, his face lit up. "You came," he said, scrambling to his feet. "Do you want to help? I'm making decorations for the tree." Charlotte knelt beside him, the edges of her coat pooling on the floor. "I'd love to." For the next hour, Ethan chattered away, telling her about the other kids in the home, his favorite teachers at school, and how he always took extra mashed potatoes at dinner. But when Charlotte gently steered the conversation toward his family, his enthusiasm dimmed. "I don't have a family," he said matter-of-factly, looping a ribbon through an ornament. "Not a real one anyway. Miss Ingrid says the people here are my family, but it's not the same." Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. "Do you remember your parents?" Ethan shook his head. "They're gone. That's what Miss Ingrid says. But I still think maybe someday I'll find them, or they'll come back. That's what I wish for every year." Miss Ingrid reappeared in the doorway, her expression heavy. "I should have told you," she said quietly as Ethan moved to a corner of the room, humming to himself. "His parents passed away when he was a baby. Car accident. He doesn't know the details, and we've never been able to bring ourselves to tell him." Charlotte looked back at Ethan, his small figure hunched over his work. "He thinks they're out there somewhere," she said softly. "That they'll come for him." Miss Ingrid nodded. "It's a hard truth to carry for someone so young, but he's resilient. That boy has a spirit like no other." Charlotte felt a pull deep in her chest, a connection she couldn't explain. She'd come to Woodhaven expecting nothing but memories and estrangement, but Ethan's hope, so fragile yet so unyielding, stirred something inside her. "I want to help him," she said suddenly. "I want to find out everything I can about his parents." Miss Ingrid blinked in surprise. That's not an easy path, Miss Holloway. Sometimes the truth doesn't bring the closure we expect. I know, Charlotte said, glancing back at Ethan. But it's a path worth taking. For him. Miss Ingrid sighed, but didn't argue. If you're sure the archives at Town Hall would be a good place to start. Charlotte nodded, determination hardening her voice. I'm sure. Ethan caught her eye as she left, waving with a grin that made her heart ache. The paper star on the tree hadn't granted his wish yet, but Charlotte silently vowed to help him find something even better, the truth. The archives at Town Hall smelled of dust and time, the air heavy with the weight of forgotten stories. Charlotte sat at a long wooden table, sifting through brittle pages and faded photographs under the glow of a single desk lamp. Ethan sat beside her, his legs swinging under the chair as he examined the stack of files she'd requested. His excitement from earlier in the day had waned, replaced by a quiet determination to uncover the answers he'd been searching for his whole life. Did you find anything? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Not yet, Charlotte replied, glancing at the pile. Birth records, property deeds, accident reports. Each document felt like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. She reached for another file, the corners of her fingers smudged with ink. But we will, I promise. Ethan nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Charlotte recognized it immediately, the same doubt that had haunted her during her own searches for meaning and connection. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Hours passed as they worked in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or the muffled laughter of a clerk in the hallway. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound marking the passage of time that felt both too fast and unbearably slow. Finally, Charlotte pulled a sheet from the bottom of a stack and froze. It was a police report dated over a decade ago, detailing a car accident that had claimed the lives of a young couple. The names matched the scant details Miss Ingrid had provided. The report described a snowy road, a skidding vehicle, and an infant found unharmed in the back seat. Her chest tightened as she scanned the page, her breath catching on each word. Ethan noticed her stillness and leaned closer. Is that about me? He asked, his voice trembling. Charlotte hesitated. She had hoped for a different ending, a miracle that might have spared Ethan the pain of this truth. But hiding it wouldn't protect him. It would only prolong the ache. Yes, she said gently, turning the paper so he could see. This is about your parents. Ethan's small hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted across the page, reading and rereading, as if searching for some hidden meaning that might change the outcome. They're gone? He asked, his voice cracking. Charlotte nodded, her heart breaking for him. Yes, they loved you, Ethan. I know they did, but they're not coming back. The boy's face crumpled as tears spilled onto his cheeks. Charlotte knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms as his small body shook with sobs. She held him tightly, murmuring soft words that she hoped would bring him even the smallest comfort. It's not fair, Ethan choked out. I waited for so long. I wished every year. I thought... I know, Charlotte said, her own voice thick with emotion. I know, sweetheart. It's not fair. They stayed like that for a long time, the clock ticking away the silence between them. When Ethan's sobs finally subsided, he pulled away slightly, his face blotchy, but his eyes burning with a new kind of resolve. So, that's it? He asked. That's all there is? No, Charlotte said firmly. That's not all. Your parents may be gone, but the people who love you now, they're your family too. Miss Ingrid, the kids at the home, they're your family. And if you want, I'd like to be part of that too. Ethan looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. You? Why? Because you've reminded me of something I'd forgotten, she said softly. You've reminded me what it means to care about someone, to want to make their life better. I've spent so long running from my past, but meeting you, it's made me realize I need to stop running. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze dropping to the paper star he clutched in his hand. After a moment, he spoke. I don't think the tree's magic, he said quietly. Not really, but maybe you're my wish. Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes, and she didn't bother to fight them. Then I'm glad you made it, Ethan. I'm glad you wished for me. Later that night, Charlotte sat in her rented room, staring out the window at the snow-covered square. Ethan was back at the group home, sleeping after the emotional weight of the day. But the journey wasn't over. There was still something left to do. Something for both of them. She reached for her phone and hesitated. Calling her siblings after all these years felt like trying to rebuild a house from its ashes. But Ethan had shown her that it was possible to start over, to forge new connections even in the face of loss. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, hesitant and guarded. "Charlotte?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "It's me. I'm in town, and I think we need to talk." The warmth of the Woodhaven Christmas festival hummed in the air, but Charlotte could hardly focus on the cheerful crowd. The square was aglow with string lights, the tree standing proudly in its center, adorned with Ethan's handmade ornaments and 100 other symbols of the season. She stood at the edge of the square, her heart racing as her siblings approached. Lila arrived first, her coat buttoned tightly against the chill, a tentative smile on her face. Behind her was Marcus, taller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched as though bracing for an emotional storm. They hadn't been together in the same place for more than a decade, not since their parents' deaths had scattered them like leaves in the wind. Now they stood a few feet apart, the space between them filled with unspoken words. "You called?" Lila said softly, her breath misting in the cold air. "I didn't think you ever would." "I didn't either," Charlotte admitted, her voice wavering. "But I needed to. I've spent so many years trying to forget what we lost. I thought if I stayed away it would hurt less, but it didn't, and I'm tired of pretending I don't care." Marcus studied her, his jaw tight. "Why now?" Charlotte hesitated, glancing at the tree. In the glow of its lights, Ethan stood at its base, waiting for her signal. "Because I met someone. A boy. He reminded me of how much we all needed each other after Mom and Dad died, and how much I let you down when I left." Lila stepped closer, her expression softening. "We all let each other down," she said. "But we were just kids, Charlotte. We didn't know how to handle it." Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was easier to blame each other than admit we were hurting, but maybe it's time we stop blaming." Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. "I want to fix this. I want us to be a family again." Lila reached for her hand, her fingers cold but steady. Marcus hesitated, then placed his hand over theirs. For the first time in years, they stood together, the rift between them slowly beginning to mend. "Is it time?" Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the square. Charlotte turned to him and nodded. The boy ran toward the tree, his paper star clutched tightly in his hand. He hesitated at the base, glancing up at the towering branches. "Too high," he muttered, looking back at Charlotte. "Can you help me?" She approached him, her siblings following behind. "Of course," she said, lifting him onto her shoulders. Ethan laughed, his small hands reaching up to place the star at the very top. When it was secure, he leaned back slightly, taking in the sight of the glowing tree. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It is," Charlotte agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She lowered him to the ground, and he immediately turned to face her. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Charlotte knelt in front of him, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I think it already has." Ethan's smile lit up his face, and for a moment, Charlotte saw a glimmer of herself in him, a younger version of who she had been, still believing in the magic of the world. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close as her siblings watched, their own smiles soft and tentative. Later that evening, back at the group home, Charlotte stood in Miss Ingrid's office. Ethan was upstairs with the other children, his laughter echoing faintly through the old house. "I want to adopt him," Charlotte said, her voice steady. Miss Ingrid blinked, her surprise quickly giving way to understanding. "That's a big commitment, Charlotte." "I know," she replied. "But I've spent too long running from the idea of family. Ethan deserves someone who'll fight for him, and I want to be that person." Miss Ingrid studied her for a moment before nodding. "I think you'll be a wonderful mother to him." Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet snow, the flakes falling gently as Charlotte and Ethan walked hand in hand through the square. Lila and Marcus followed close behind, their arms full of ornaments for next year's tree. The town's lights sparkled around them, casting the moment in a golden glow. As they reached the tree, Ethan paused, looking up at the paper star he had placed at the top. "I think my wish came true," he said quietly. Charlotte knelt beside him. "What did you wish for?" Ethan smiled, his face glowing with a mix of innocence and wisdom beyond his years. "A family." Tears filled Charlotte's eyes as she pulled him into a hug. "You gave me that too," she whispered. "You're my wish come true, Ethan." Lila and Marcus joined them, their presence a quiet promise of a future rebuilt from the pieces of their past. Together, they stood beneath the tree, the weight of old wounds fading in the warmth of new beginning. The paper star gleamed brightly above them, a symbol of hope, love, and the family they had all found in one another. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment. What moment moved you most? Your thoughts inspire us to keep sharing tales of love, resilience, and hope.